Hi, welcome to the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. My name is Jason Loviglio. I'm Director of Media and Communication Studies here, and today we're talking with Dr. Christine Mallinson of the Language Literacy and Culture Department. And she's here to talk to us about her new book, Understanding English Variation in U.S. Schools. Christine, how'd you become interested in sociolinguistics?
Well, I've always been interested in language and culture and society. So I grew up in the South to a family where my parents were from the North. My grandparents were from Germany, so I heard all kinds of different languages and language varieties around me while I was growing up. And I just have always been fascinated in the ways that language is a part of who we are as our, in our culture and our identity. I went on in college and graduate school to really study how language plays a role in different regional groups, different ethnic and cultural groups, social groups, different age groups. And I got really interested in variation in English. So that is sort of the topic of my book, but also my research, throughout my career as a sociolinguist. And that is really what drives me to be passionate about what I do.
It's interesting. Now, say a bit more about what sociolinguists think about the relationship between language and culture. It's a fairly new field, isn't it?
Well, the field itself really has been around, as a distinct field for probably about 60 years. But before that, there's been a long interest in language and culture and in language and regional diversity. So sociolinguists are really interested in exploring how language in many ways is culture. So language tells us something about who we are as people. Who we are influences the language choices that we make. So, for example, in the South, you might hear people using ma'am and sir. That may tell you something about differences in that culture and differences in how respect is shown. That may differ from other parts of the U.S. Same thing with different languages around the world. You may also see differences in words that are used or grammatical patterns or the sounds that we make. So if I pronounce the word dog as dog, it's easy to tell where I come from. So linguists are really interested in how culture, kind of is an index for the ways that we talk to each other in our specific social groups.
Often educators and others in positions of some cultural authority will look on variations of the kind you describe as deficits. What do sociolinguists as a discipline tend to think about debates around these issues?
Well, linguists really view language differences as not being deficits. So they view language differences as being differences that naturally arise. Language is always changing and always evolving. So no matter what language you have, right, the old adage is that the only language that isn't changing is a dead language, right? Because as people change over time, new groups come into contact, new words arise, new ways of saying things arise. So language differences arise naturally as a natural byproduct of language evolution. So these differences are not any better or any worse than any other ways of saying things. These are all differences that have arisen out of the ways people interact. So linguists are usually fascinated by how did we get these different types of language patterns. They may be interested in how language has changed over time, so they may be interested in historical linguistics. They may be interested in the ways that language influences a child's development, so psycholinguistics, so the ways that children learn language and use language and develop over time, or the area of speech-language pathology is interested in how language differences are sometimes have challenges for different groups of people. And then sociolinguists are interested in how language is a social marker. So we're really interested in how language can tell us something about who we are as people, and not really viewing that necessarily through the same lens that you may in an English class, where standard English is definitely the norm that is upheld. So we definitely believe that there is the importance of standard English. At the same time, it's important to understand all the different natural and normal language differences that arise. So somebody may be extremely fluent in standard English and grow up like I did, speaking a variety of English, Southern English, that in many ways differs in terms of word choice or grammar or sound system from standard English.
Interesting. Now you say we. How did you and your co-author for the book, Ann Charity Hudley, get the idea for writing a book about understanding English language variation within the context of U.S. schools?
Well, both my co-author and I grew up in the South. So I grew up in North Carolina, and Charity Hudley grew up in Virginia. And so we were really exposed to the fact that, especially for Southerners, language is a key part of who we are, but language can also be very stigmatized. So sometimes the language of Southerners is viewed as being deficient or backwards or less correct or less formal in some way. Anna's also African American, and a lot of times African Americans, the way that they talk is also stigmatized. So we both grew up with this real view of what it feels like to be on the receiving end of linguistic criticism. But I also think that we both grew up with a real appreciation for language differences and understanding sort of the nuances of different dialects and how that really plays a role in how we interact with our friends and family. So we both had this love of language, I think, that drove us into the field of sociolinguistics. Once we got into the field and we did a lot of research and reading throughout our careers, I think we realized very, very early on that language is something that really matters in education. And as linguists, we have a lot of specialized knowledge about language learning, literacy, that is so useful in the classroom and so important in the classroom. And so our goal with writing this book was to make linguistic information accessible, so to put this in a very readable format that clearly presents linguistic information, and in a way that really ties it very closely and carefully with what current research is in education. So understanding how language really fits into educational contexts.
Why is it so important for teachers to understand language variation?
Well, I think it's important on a number of levels. First, teachers really already know that language is the backbone for what kids are doing in the classroom, and really students of all ages. So even, really across the board, students are always writing, they're always speaking, they're reading. So language is always front and center. One of the teachers who we worked with in Baltimore said that language is a rope that all other educational issues are tied around. So we really believe that. You definitely see this in younger grades when kids are learning how to read. So what happens often is that language varieties, which may differ from standard English in really regular and expected and patterned ways, those can cause differences for children when they're learning to read. So if a young student grows up in the South, many Southerners will pronounce the words P-I-N and P-E-N the same. So as pin and pin versus pin and pen. For a student who's learning how to read, because they have this vowel merger, may end up spelling words that have those, what for a standard speaker would be different vowel sounds. They may end up pronouncing them the same and therefore also spelling them the same. So you may find students spelling pin and pen as P-I-N. You may find that carrying through into older grades with less familiar words, something like wince, W-I-N-C-E, and whence, W-H-E-N-C-E, may be spelled with the same vowel because of that sound transfer to written language. So you see it in learning how to read and learning how to write and spell.
So understanding some of the common vowel mergers or some of the other features that might be endemic in a particular neighborhood or a particular community or region will be helpful. Exactly.
We have a lot of information like that in the book and a lot of strategies that teachers can use both to understand where these features are coming from. Okay, so the historical, regional, social context. The historical context is very important, but really understanding even more than that, the fact that these are not deficits, that these are language differences and that they're culturally rooted. We also have strategies for how teachers can work with students when they're correcting papers, when they're preparing students for standardized tests. So, tests, often the essay prompts that students respond to, these are often written in a language that's more closer to what a standard speaker might use. So students who grow up not necessarily speaking standard English in the home, for them they may have an added challenge when they're trying to understand word problems, let's say, or essay prompts on a standardized test or SAT test questions. So teachers, it's important for them to understand not only what are the patterns of standard English, but then what are the patterns that students are coming with from their home varieties, and then how these are similar or different. In many cases, there are similarities, but in some cases, there are major differences with sound system or with different words that are used or grammatical patterns. One example is in some varieties of English, you can have different uses of negative words. So you might say something like, I can't hardly never hear what she's saying, instead of I can hardly hear what she's saying. Both of those are used to mean negative statements, but in the case of I can't hardly never hear what she's saying, even though that may be used for emphasis or it may be used to get the point across clearly, that's the type of thing that may be marked wrong in a standardized test. A lot of students don't realize that something like the word hardly can be counted as a negative word, because most of our negative words in English start with N, not, neither, nor, never. So words like hardly, which can carry a negative connotation, may not be something that students are ever taught that counts as a double negative, right? So for teachers to understand what different language features are at issue when preparing for standardized tests, when teaching students how to read, when correcting writing, is definitely important. But then teachers also need to understand, which is what we really help with in the book, how to differentiate linguistic features from errors. So there's a difference when a feature occurs in a regular or patterned way. Teachers can spot that in a different way, and then they can work with students to address those issues, help them understand the differences and similarities between standard English if they understand the patterns endemic in the variety. We have, worked with, at this point, really hundreds of educators throughout the U.S., mostly with Maryland and Virginia. And so many teachers have come to us and said, I want to participate in professional development. I would like to learn more information about language and culture. American schools are increasingly diversifying, and language is a key part of that. So teachers really understand that front and center language and communication issues are at work in their classrooms. They want to understand how to address some of the differences that they're seeing, and really how to understand some of the differences that they're seeing. So for us, we have really found that there is just an intense interest in learning more. And I think when resources are available for teachers to be able to utilize that, we have seen great success.
Talk a bit about the work you've done with teachers in Baltimore in particular.
I've worked with Baltimore teachers in a number of different venues. So one capacity was where I have co-led with my co-author Ann Charity Hudley professional development seminars with Baltimore teachers of all different grades, all different subject areas. And these teachers have attended a 3-day seminar in which we have sort of explained some of the key issues surrounding language and culture. We've talked a lot about challenges that they may be facing in the classroom, ways that linguistics can be brought to bear on those topics and issues that they're facing. And then what we have done in our research is we have worked with teachers after that to interview them about their experiences, to study ways that they have taken what they've learned in professional development and applied it back into their classroom settings, because that is what is really exciting for us as linguists, how teachers apply what they've learned and how they make use of what they have learned about language in the classroom. So how they integrate it into their teaching, how they integrate it into their assessment practices, how their views have changed even on the importance of language and culture, and explaining to students that everyone's culture is valued here, everyone's language is valued here. And teachers are very excited about that. So we have I think 40 or 50 different teachers currently participating in a research project that we have that was funded by the National Science Foundation to really understand how teachers are putting this information into work in their classrooms.
And you mentioned before that you worked with teachers from all disciplines. And of course, the examples that spring to mind when we talk about English variation have to do with spelling, language arts, things like that. How do these issues of understanding linguistic diversity matter in math and science classrooms?
Well, we really think that this information is crucial for any teacher of any grade level, any content area. Students don't leave their language patterns at the door when they enter the math classroom, when they enter the science classroom, the art classroom. Language really is front and center in all of those different subject areas. So if we think about it, even something like math isn't taught just using numbers, it's taught using language. So a lot of times language is really that vehicle for teaching all types of subject matter. For example, you might see that increasingly we're relying on word problems to assess students. And sometimes linguistic biases can creep in the ways that test questions are worded. So it's important to sort of discuss those with teachers so that they can help their students prepare for tests. It's also the case that sometimes, one example is that I once saw a word problem where some of the text in the word problem used New York City dialect features and word features. And so those were less able to be easily understood by students who weren't familiar with that type of English. There was another study that looked at math word problems by students who were raised in urban areas, and some of those math problems included words like stalk, like how many stalks of corn, can you count, or the word milking. And those questions were more difficult for students who didn't have a background where they knew immediately what words like stalk were or what words like milking were. So a lot of the ways that even things like math and science are assessed is by using language. And sometimes when that language is further away from the language that a student is used to speaking at home, those word problems can be harder to answer. They can maybe take a little bit longer time to figure out what the question is asking. And of course, on standardized tests, those extra minutes are crucial. So a lot of what we've talked about in the book is strategies for teachers to find ways to make sure that the language of word problems is taught just as carefully as the math computational skills themselves. Same goes for science teachers.
Right, that makes sense. We're discussing Understanding English Variation in U.S. Schools by Ann Charity Hudley and Christine Mallinson, who's here with me. As you were talking about the differences in regional dialects, it occurred to me that America must confront some of these challenges and some of these sort of interesting opportunities for thinking about language variation in larger measure than other developed countries because of our vast size, different regions, history of racial segregation, enormous amount of recent and not so recent immigration. Where are we relative to other nations in the West and beyond in terms of thinking about language variation as a component of cultural diversity, as a component of successful education in schools? How does America stack up in terms of this?
Well, the U.S. really faces some real challenges in terms of its unique history when it comes to language and language variation. So the U.S. was settled by groups of people who came from different countries, bringing their languages with them. Of course, there were indigenous languages that had existed for centuries, of course, in the Americas. Situations of language contact often lead to unique varieties, but they can also sometimes lead to tensions. So we've seen a lot of discussion about linguistic genocide that happened to Native American cultural groups. There can also be tensions surrounding, for example, when, in America's founding history, there was a question of whether German was going to be the official language or English. And of course now there's those similar tensions that are rising when people are thinking about Spanish and the role of Spanish in the U.S. vis-a-vis English. There are other countries that really, I think, have an excellent model for how we can think about language in politics, such as Switzerland with 4 official languages, or many other countries that have numerous official languages as well. But I think within the US, I think our attention to culture, our attention to sort of what makes us tick, we're very interested as a people in what makes us who we are. And I think if we focus on language in that regard, we can really learn some things about ourselves. Language really can tell us who we are. It can tell us how we're comfortable talking to each other, how we're comfortable expressing ourselves, our cultural concepts. So I really think that just as much as language is important to the sciences, it's also really important to the humanities and to understanding, who we are as a people, to cultural studies, American studies as well.
What about outside the school context? Does understanding linguistic variation matter to other important cultural institutions beyond the school?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, it can really matter in serious ways. One of our colleagues, Ann's and my colleagues, John Baugh, who's at University of St. Louis, his research examines linguistic profiling, which is the situation where someone may call over the phone to rent an apartment, to apply for a job, any other number of situations where no one can actually see who you are. And the person on the other end of the phone may, based on the way that you sound, decide that they don't want you for that job, or they don't want you for that apartment or that house. So in his research, he has the ability to use 3 different types of accents, white, African American, and Chicano accents. So he would call in sort of an auditing situation where he would call, and based on his different accents, when he used a more white accent, people were more likely to rent him an apartment, to offer him a job. And these are real issues that have been picked up by the EEOC, by HUD, where really attention is being drawn to the fact that it is not legal to discriminate against someone based on the way that they sound as a proxy for their race, their national origin. So these issues really matter. I think a lot of these same issues are the ones that play out in the classroom as well. And understanding even, in kindergarten all the way through the college classroom, that language is a real marker of culture and personal identity, also racial and ethnic identity, regional and national identity, really goes a long way towards working to eliminate some of those biases.
Interesting. And I would imagine, in stepping into my area of expertise a bit, that in the world of media, particularly children's media, which is so now and forever, but especially in the age of Pixar, so dominated by, on television and in film, by animation, where the voice is often the single human identifying characteristic. When it's the character is a troll or a donkey or whatever it is, there's so much about a character's persona is going to be conveyed by voice. Has there been work looking at the ways that children are being inculcated with certain ideas about language and identity using linguistic profiling or stereotyping, as you described?
Yeah, there's been a lot of research looking at the ways that voice is used in film, particularly in Disney films. So the ways that often racial and ethnic accents are used for animal characters in an offensive way. Some research has looked at that. You do see in some regards, Disney changing. So The Princess and the Frog uses a really authentic Cajun accent for the main character. This is kind of a new development, I would say, for Disney films, which had not a great track record for their use of accents. Often a Southern accent will be used by the character who is supposed to be less intelligent, or an urban accent, a New York accent is often used by a character who's tough or who's mean. So we see a lot of stereotyping in films that often draws upon language to use as a vehicle for those stereotypes. So I think awareness is increasingly being drawn to how that can be offensive to different cultural groups and ethnic groups. And I think we have seen that, in companies like Disney, them changing their ways.
Great. Great. You mentioned your work with math and science. University of Maryland, Baltimore County has recently awarded you a grant to do more with math and science and the issue of language variation. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah. I was awarded an SRAIS grant from UMBC to do research with math and science teachers. We have worked so far, my research assistants and I, in collecting interviews from probably about 15 different math and science teachers so far, and really working with them to understand, okay, once they've received more information, professional development about language variation, then how has that been reflected in their classrooms? How has that come into their teaching? So several teachers have commented that now they're really aware about the differences in language, and this has helped them understand their students better, to communicate better with their students. One teacher said that she is now going to be incorporating language variation more into her math and her science labs. So doing science fair projects, she's going to have students explore more about how cultural elements fit in with science. So for example, how quilting patterns might be looked at in terms of geometry, or how African hair braiding techniques may have designs that are similar to fractals or similar to other geometric designs. And that work has been done also by people like Professor Ron Eglish, who has really investigated the connections between math and culture more deeply. So we found a lot of positive evidence from the teachers who we've worked with that really language does have a place in the math and science curriculum.
Thanks so much for talking with us. This is Christine Mallinson from UMBC's Language Literacy and Culture program, and she's been discussing her new book, Understanding English Language Variation in U.S. Schools. Thanks.